All right, happy Baden Hill campers. It's time for our lightning round fights review. And this will be quick, but remember you should pause after the term, which is a person, place, thing, or event. And then I'm going to give a brief explanation. I'm not going to give a textbook explanation. I'm going to give 3 or 4 words, hopefully, that will pin it down. And I want you to practice this, boil things down so that it's easier to remember. And away we go. Ken Burns, he's a documentary filmmaker who's responsible for the Civil War documentary. Nat Turner, he's a slave who led an uprising, and it was very effective and scared many people in the South. William Lloyd Garrison, he was a publisher of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper. Frederick Douglass, a former slave who wrote an autobiography, and he was very persuasive in his abolitionist views. Harriet Tubman, she is considered the conductor of the Underground Railroad, a former slave who helped other slaves escape. John Greenleaf Whittier, he is a poet who was an abolitionist and wrote in favor of abolition and against slavery. Eli Whitney, he invented the cotton gin, which changed the economy of the South so that slavery became profitable. Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which changed people's views about slavery and promoted abolition. John Brown, he was the leader of a group who was against slavery, and he actually led militias to fight against those who promoted slavery, and he eventually was executed. Stephen Douglas, he was the senator in Illinois who debated Lincoln and eventually lost to Lincoln. Charles Sumner, he was a congressman from Massachusetts, a senator from Massachusetts, and he was beaten with a cane on the floor of the Senate by a pro-slavery senator. Jefferson Davis, he was a senator from Mississippi, and he ended up being the president of the Confederacy. Robert E. Lee, a former general for the U.S. Army, he became the head of the Confederacy, the Confederate forces. Ulysses S. Grant, he was the general in charge of the North forces, the Union forces, and he eventually became president. William T. Sherman, he's famous for his March to the Sea, for burning Atlanta, and for promising former slaves 40 acres and a mule. George B. McClellan, a famous Northern general who fought at the Battle of Gettysburg and various other battles. Stonewall Jackson, a Confederate general who was famous for his tenacity. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln during Our American Cousin in Ford's Theater on April 15th, 1865. Andrew Johnson, President Lincoln's vice president, who was actually a Southern Democrat, but who became president when Lincoln was assassinated. He was the first president to be impeached, but it was not successful, and he remained in office. Indira Gandhi was the daughter of Jawaharlal Nehru, and she ended up being prime minister. She declared the emergency and became somewhat of a dictator, but she's remembered as a great female leader. Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was the father of modern China, the head of the KMT party, and the first president of the Republic of China. Yuan Shikai was a Qing general who switched sides when he was promised that he would become president, and he was not a good president, and eventually the warlord period resulted. Song Meiling was the wife of Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek was the protege of Sun Yat-sen, and Song Meiling was an amazing speaker and female leader. She was the first woman ever to address the House of Representatives. Mao Zedong, he was the leader of the Communist Party in China. He went on the Long March. He eventually defeated Chiang Kai-shek's forces and established the People's Republic of China. Mikhail Borodin, he was a revolutionary with Lenin in Russia, but eventually he was able to leave Russia. He was exiled, and he went to the United States, had a new life there. He went to Valparaiso University. He eventually went back to help the revolution in Russia and in China as well, working with Comintern. Zhou Enlai, he was a student of Chiang Kai-shek at the Huangpu Academy, the military academy. He also became prime minister eventually, and he met with Richard Nixon as the communist premier of China. Gang of Four. The Gang of Four led the Cultural Revolution. Jiang Qing, who was the wife of Mao, was one of these four. Mao was not one of the four. Charles de Gaulle. He was the leader of France after World War II especially, and he did not have a great relationship with President Roosevelt and the other allies, and wanted to establish France as a strong power again. Harry S. Truman. This was the president who took over after Roosevelt. He dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he was known for his Truman Doctrine, which declared that the United States would help those fighting against communism. Douglas MacArthur. He was the general who led the forces, United Nations forces during the Korean War. He was too aggressive, and President Truman fired him. Lyndon Johnson. He was the president who followed JFK. He escalated the war in Vietnam, and eventually he would not run for a second term because of the problems of the Vietnam War. He did do a lot for civil rights in the United States. William Calley. Lieutenant Calley ordered the My Lai massacre. He was imprisoned but later released, maybe to cover up some of the things that the government had done. Robert F. Kennedy. He was the brother of John F. Kennedy, and he served as the Attorney General for JFK. He was assassinated in June of 1968 because he had secured the nomination for the Democratic Party and probably would have been president. Kofi Annan. A diplomat, a statesman from Ghana who became the Secretary General of the United Nations. Omar al-Bashir, the dictator of Sudan who is responsible for genocide in Darfur. Joseph Kony, a leader of the Lord's Resistance Army who kidnapped children to serve in his army in Uganda, and eventually he fled to Sudan and is still at large. Mobutu Sese Seko, the dictator, the long-term dictator of the country of Zaire. Eventually, Zaire was invaded in 1996, and it led to a new dictator, Laurent Kabila. Laurent Kabila, the dictator who changed the name of Zaire to the Democratic Republic of Congo, but he served as a dictator as well after Sese Seko. Joseph Kabila, the son of Laurent Kabila, who took over when his father was assassinated, and he served as a dictator essentially, and only recently gave up the presidency, and the elections after him were considered flawed and perhaps corrupt. Places. Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Harper's Ferry, the location of John Brown's raid to try to inspire a slave uprising in the South. It's currently in West Virginia. Tashkent, a city in the former Soviet Union that was the site of the peace talks after the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. And mysteriously, the Prime Minister of India died at that conference. Jammu and Kashmir, a province of India that is known for its conflict between Pakistan and India. Both of them claim that territory and are fighting over it to this day. Bangladesh, formerly East Pakistan, and gained independence in 1971. Valparaiso, Indiana. The University of Valparaiso University is in Valparaiso, Indiana, and Mikhail Borodin attended. That was also my school. Port Arthur, a city that is currently in China and has served as a warm water port for Russia and China and Japan over the years. Crimean Peninsula, the location of the Yalta Conference at which the Soviet Union was given many assurances, and it led to the takeover of North Korea by the Soviet Union. Yalu River. This is the border between the Soviet Union and North Korea. Panmunjom. This is the village that was on the 38th parallel and was seen as kind of a dividing line between North and South Korea. Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon. This is the capital of South Vietnam during the Vietnam War and the period where there was a South Vietnam. Today it is called Ho Chi Minh City after the founder of North Vietnam and the Vietnam Communist, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. Somalia, a very impoverished country that is a site of much terrorism, and the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization is currently based there and doing much damage there. Sudan. This is a country that has been recently divided into Sudan and South Sudan because of ethnic conflicts, and again, it's been ruled by a dictator. Darfur. Darfur is a region in Sudan that has faced genocide because of the dictator. South Sudan. This is the new nation that has, through a vote, broke away from Sudan. Tanzania. This is the location of one of the embassies that was bombed in 1998, an act of terror. Ghana, a much more developed country in West Africa that is very diverse in its economy and has a lot of hope for the future. Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly called Zaire. This has been ruled by a dictator for decades. South Vietnam. This is what the area of the southern part of Vietnam, including Saigon, was called before it was conquered by North Vietnam. Pusan Perimeter. This is the small portion of the Korean Peninsula where the United Nations troops were forced by the North Korean army until the United Nations had a victory at the Battle of Incheon and drove the North Korean forces back. Things. Abolitionist, one who argues against slavery. The Liberator, the newspaper started by William Lloyd Garrison and was an instrument of abolition argument. Underground Railroad. This was the way that slaves were helped to escape from the South, using safe houses all the way from the South to the North. Indentured servants. Back in the time of English colonization, workers from England could come for 7 years or so, and they eventually got their freedom. Cotton gin. Invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney, it changed the economy of the South. Popular sovereignty. This is the idea that The people in a local area can decide for themselves how they want to govern themselves. It related to Kansas, Nebraska territory and their choice for slavery or no slavery. Secession. This means to leave a union, to break away from a country. Mason-Dixon line. This line goes back more than 150 years and was just west of Delaware, but eventually it was symbolically moved south of Maryland and divided the North from the South. Free states. These are states where slavery was illegal. Slave states. States where slavery was legal, mostly in the South. In fact, all in the South, Texas too. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, this promoted the idea that slaves were human beings and slavery was a crime. John Brown's Body. This was a popular song set to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and it memorialized John Brown and his fight against slavery. A House Divided Against Itself. This is a quote by Lincoln, and his feeling is that eventually the United States would become one thing or another, but it couldn't remain divided. Confederate States of America, also Confederacy. These are the states where slavery was legal and they broke away. They seceded from the Union. Monitor versus Merrimack. This is the Battle of the Ironclad Ships, basically the first modern naval battle. Emancipation Proclamation. This was issued in 1863 by Abraham Lincoln as a means for freeing the slaves in the Confederacy. Gettysburg Address. After the Battle of Gettysburg, this is Lincoln's famous address 77 years ago. Ford's Theater. This is where Lincoln was assassinated. Jim Crow. This is a character from folklore, and eventually it was used to make fun of African Americans, and specifically it was used to describe laws that kept African Americans from being full citizens. It kept them separate from white people. Freedmen's Bureau. This was an organization designed to help slaves transition to a free life. Hindutva. This is the philosophy or the idea that Hinduism should be the way of India. It was a nationalist ideology. Satanic Verses. A novel written by Salman Rushdie, and it was very controversial. It led to Iran declaring that Rushdie should die and should be killed. It was about Islam, but it was also about Hinduism. Mujahideen. These are the freedom fighters that fought in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union after their invasion in 1980 and beyond. Comintern. This is an organization that sought to spread communism throughout the world. National Palace Museum. This is the museum and all of its artifacts, 20,000 crates that were moved by Chiang Kai-shek and his army to avoid the Japanese and then the communists, and eventually ended up in Taiwan, where it is today. 5-year plans. These are traditional communist ways to organize government and economy and have results within 5 years. Pig iron. In China, the first 5-year plan sought to increase steel production. People were only able to make pig iron using what they found, the scraps they found. Martial law. This is the declaration that the army is in control of a country and serves as a police force, and there are basically no freedoms for the people. Taiwan Economic Miracle. During the 1960s, this was the result of a lot of investment from the United States and other countries to support the Republic of China in Taiwan during that time. The Truman Doctrine. This is the belief that Truman had that the United States would fight against the spread of communism everywhere and would support countries that were fighting against communism. 38th parallel. This is the dividing line between North and South Korea during the Korean War. DMZ. This is the name for the border between North and South Korea today. It's demilitarized zone. USS Maddox. This was the first ship that was fired on in the Gulf of Tonkin to start the escalation of the Vietnam War for the United States. C. Turner Joy. This is the second ship that joined the USS Maddox during an incident that actually was not an attack by the Vietnamese, but that led to the declaration by Congress to allow President Johnson to escalate the war. Viet Cong. This is the nickname for the enemy, the insurgents, the rebels who were in South Vietnam who fought against U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. Nepotism. This is the hiring of family members for a government or for a business. Coup d'etat. This is an overthrowing of this state, a military uprising. Akim. This is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, a terrorist organization that's been fighting and kidnapping people in Morocco and Tunisia and North Africa. Al-Qaeda, created by Osama bin Laden, responsible for many terrorist attacks in the late 90s and especially 9/11. Al-Shabaab, a partner with Al-Qaeda, but mainly in Somalia and other North African nations. Lord's Resistance Army, the army led by Joseph Kony, and they kidnapped children to serve in the army, and they tried to overthrow the Ugandan government. Events. Stono Rebellion. This was the first slave rebellion in the 1700s, and it wasn't very successful, but it made the white slave owners increase the laws, keeping slaves from having any freedom at all. Nat Turner's Rebellion. This was a second rebellion in the early 1800s, and it led to increased laws limiting freedom and certainly limiting education for slaves. Dred Scott decision. This was a Supreme Court decision that decided that a slave, even though he had lived on free soil for much of his life, he was not free and had to return to be a slave of his owner. Missouri Compromise. This involved allowing slavery in Missouri, but allowing Maine to be admitted to the Union as a free state. Mexican-American War. This was the battle for the Southwest, and it added much territory to the United States. Compromise of 1850. This was how California entered the Union, and it had to be a compromise so that the balance was maintained. Bleeding Kansas. This is the name for the fighting that occurred because Kansas and Nebraska territories were allowed to choose for themselves by popular sovereignty whether they would be slave or free. Lawrence Massacre. This was an invasion of pro-slavery soldiers, fighters who came to Lawrence, Kansas and killed whoever they found. Potawatomi Massacre. This was a revenge attack by John Brown and his sons and some others, killing pro-slavery settlers because of the Lawrence Massacre. Harper's Ferry Raid. This is when John Brown was captured. Again, he was trying to start a slave uprising. Lincoln-Douglas debates. These were the debates over slavery and what to do about it. as Lincoln and Douglas ran for the Senate in Illinois. U.S. election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln was elected president with 40% of the vote because there was a division within the parties between North and South. Attack on Fort Sumter. After states began seceding after the election of 1860, eventually off the coast of South Carolina, the first attack by the Confederacy on a Union outpost happened at Fort Sumter. First Battle of Bull Run. This was the first battle of the Civil War, and it was a Confederacy victory, but it also showed that the war would not be quick. Battle of Antietam Creek. This is the single most bloody day in U.S. history. Battle of Gettysburg. A turning point in the war. It kept the Confederacy from invading the North. March to the Sea. General Sherman burned Atlanta and marched to the sea, burning everything in sight and destroying things to basically demoralize the South. Siege of Vicksburg, a pivotal battle that divided the Confederacy and kept Texas out of the war and basically secured the Mississippi River for the Union. Appomattox Courthouse. This is where General Lee surrendered to Union forces. Reconstruction. This is the period in the late 1860s and 1870s by which the South was rebuilt and the government was redesigned so that African Americans could be citizens. But the Compromise of 1877 would mean that there was no way to enforce these new laws. New Orleans Massacre. This is one example when African Americans were seeking full citizenship. There was a massacre of some of the people who were parading in the street. Plessy versus Ferguson decision. This was a decision at the end of the 1800s that decided that it was okay to separate black people and white people in the United States. Civil Rights Act of 1875. This established citizenship for African Americans, but again, it was not enforced, and Jim Crow laws kept it from being a reality. The Compromise of 1877, the main thing was that the troops were withdrawn if the Confederacy would stop fighting against civil rights for African Americans. But again, it wasn't enforced. Operation Gibraltar. This was an insurgency created by Pakistan in Bangladesh, in Kashmir, and it was a huge failure. And that led to basically a stalemate in the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. Indo-Pakistani War of 1965 ended in a stalemate. It was over Kashmir in the west of the country. Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 was in the east, and it was basically the war for Bangladesh independence. The emergency. It's a name for the period declared by Indira Gandhi to protect the government, but it ended up suspending freedoms and is seen as kind of making her a dictator. Tashkent Declaration. This was the end of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965. Bengali language movement. This was in Bangladesh and led to some of the war for independence momentum, because the Bengali language is what the people in Bangladesh wanted to speak. They didn't want to speak Urdu, which was the Pakistan language. Warlord period. This is in China after Yuan Shikai died. The Second United Front is when the communists and the nationalists fought together against Japan starting in 1931. The White Terror is the period from 1927 really until 1947, where Chiang Kai-shek tried to get rid of communists. The Long March is when Chiang Kai-shek forced Mao Zedong to flee his outpost in Jiangxi province, and eventually he had to march 10,000 kilometers, 6,000 miles. 228. This is an incident in Taiwan where many people were massacred because the nationalists felt that there was an uprising against them. Great Leap Forward. This is Mao's attempt to move the country faster, and it was a disaster and led to the Great Chinese Famine. The Great Chinese Famine took place during the Great Leap Forward, and 50 million people died. Cultural Revolution. This is the period led by the Gang of Four. It was from 1966 to 1976, and it was a disaster, and people today in China see it as a terrible thing that was done by, it was allowed by Mao, but it was done by the Gang of Four. Yalta Conference. This is the conference that was near the end of World War II, and it basically gave the Soviet Union a lot of control over the East in return for them supporting the Allies in the war against Japan. Battle of Incheon. This was really a rescue mission by the United Nations, which saved South Korea and allowed the U.S. forces to push north. Gulf of Tonkin incident. This is the beginning of the escalation of the Vietnam War, and it came because the USS Maddox was fired upon and then later thought that it was fired upon. Operation Rolling Thunder. This began in March of 1965 and continued until November of 1968. It was a bombing campaign in North Vietnam to intimidate and to absolutely to demoralize the North. Tet Offensive. This was a surprise attack in South Vietnam by Viet Cong and Viet Minh forces who had infiltrated the South. It happened over the Lunar New Year holiday in 1968. Year of Africa. 1960 is seen as the Year of Africa because of all of the independence movements in that year. Embassy bombings of 1998. This happened in Tanzania and Kenya. It's connected to Al-Qaeda and was a destabilizing terrorist attack. Ghana Civil War of 1994. This is a disturbance in 1994. It did result in many people dead, but Ghana has been relatively stable since that period of ethnic fighting. Rwandan genocide. This was in 1994, and it resulted in hundreds of thousands of people being killed because of ethnic cleansing. Invasion of Zaire. This happened because of the Rwandan genocide and led to the overthrow of Sese Seko. Arab Spring. In 2010, many North African Muslim nations, Arab nations, and also in the Middle East, they had a popular uprising and were able to throw off their leaders, and some democracy was established in places like Tunisia and Morocco. Thanks for watching. I hope this helps.